Hi, it's casual Sunday. Hope you don't mind. I've been out and about already today. I'm going to read to you The Wood Maiden, a Czech fairy tale, as told by Carolyn Emerick. And you can see where to find her books and magazines in the link below. Thank you. Once upon a time, there was a little girl called Batushka. Her mother was a poor widow with nothing but a small rundown cottage and two little nanny goats. But although they were very poor, Batushka was always cheerful. From the spring through the summer and into autumn, it was Batushka's job to bring the goats out into the birch forest each day to let them graze there. And every morning, when she left home, her mother gave her a little basket filled with a slice of bread for her lunch, a pile of flax to be spun into yarn, and a spindle. Be sure to bring home a full spindle, her mother said each morning. Because they were so poor, Batushka did not even have a distaff to wind the flax around, so she always wrapped it round her head. Then she took her basket and skipped along behind her nanny goats into the birch wood. When they were deep into the woods, Batushka sat down under a tree and pulled the fibers of the flax from her head with her left hand, and with her right hand she held the spindle so that it spun round on the ground. While she spun the fibers into yarn, she always happily sang a song. She sang so merrily that all the woods echoed as her goats nibbled happily away at the leaves and the grass. When the sun rose high in the sky, Batushka knew it was time for her midday meal. She always shared a bit with the goats, and then went into the woods to search for berries and whatever wild fruit might be in season. After her meal of fruit and bread, the girl always took a break from her work to dance and sing happily in the sunlight before sitting back down to finish her spinning. And every time she danced under the sun, he smiled down on her and thought, what a merry little shepherdess she is. And every day after her dance, Batushka sat down and returned to her spinning. Her mother never had to scold her when she returned home in the evening because her spindle was always full. One Once particular afternoon, as she did her daily routine, something very unusual happened. Matushka had just finished her meal and was ready to start dancing. Suddenly there appeared before her eyes the most beautiful maiden she had ever seen. The lady glowed radiantly and was dressed in a silky white gauze that was as fine as a spider's web. Her long golden hair reached to her waist, and colorful woodland flowers encircled her head. Batushka stood rendered quite speechless by this sight, but the maiden smiled gently and said to her very sweetly, Batushka, do you like to dance? A fairy tale illustration by Warwick Goebel. Well, kindness radiated from this shining lady, so Batushka's fear quickly faded, and she answered with excitement, oh, I love to dance. I could dance all day. Then come, said the maiden, let's dance together. I will teach you my dance. And just so, the good lady tucked up her skirt, took Batushka's hands, and together they began to dance. As soon as the maiden and the girl began swirling, all at once an orchestra of enchanting music began to play around them. It was the most beautiful music that Batushka had ever heard. She looked around and saw tiny little musicians sitting on the branches of the birch trees. They were the birds of the forest, larks, nightingales, finches, linnets, thrushes, and more. They were called to sing by the maiden herself. But unlike ordinary birds, these birds were clothed in little frocks and jackets. Batushka could not believe her eyes, and her body thrilled with exhilaration at the experience. Her cheeks glowed as if she had been laughing for an hour. and her eyes shone brightly with happiness. For the first time ever, the girl forgot all about her goats and her spinning. All she could do was gaze at this beautiful maiden who was her dance partner, and together they moved with such grace and lightness that Batushka could not even feel the grass under her feet. They danced and they danced from noon until sundown. Batushka did not feel the least bit tired at all and would have danced on all night. But suddenly their dance came to a stop. The music silenced and the beautiful maiden disappeared as suddenly as she had come. Fairy tale illustration by Jenny Harbour. Now she was all alone in the woods. She looked around her stunned as she saw the sun sinking low through the trees. She placed her hands on her head, where all the unspun flax still remained. Then she glanced down at her spindle and saw it laying there empty in the grass. She took the flax from off her head and laid it with the spindle in her basket, called her two nanny goats, and started to walk home. The poor girl scolded herself for not getting her chore complete. She was angry at herself for allowing the beautiful maiden to distract her from her work. So quiet was she that even the goats kept looking back nervously to make sure she was still behind them, for they were used to Petushka's merry songs along their walk. As she approached the cottage, the girl's mother noticed that her daughter was not her cheerful self and asked, "Are you sick, Petushka?" Quickly, Batushka thought up an answer and replied, "No, my mother dear, I am not sick, but I was singing so much today that my throat is sore." Well, that could have been true. Batushka devised a plan to make up for the missing flax. She knew that her mother would not reel the yarn immediately, so hid the empty spindle. Her plan was to work extra hard tomorrow to make up for the missing yarn from today. She did not breathe a word about the beautiful maiden to her mother. There's Girl with a Distaff and Drop Spindle, art by William Bourgereau. Bourgereau. After a good night's rest, Batushka awoke refreshed and was back to her usual self. As cheerful as usual, she walked along with her nanny goats to graze in the birchwood, singing happily all the while. When they reached the woodland, she sat down to do her spinning, singing the morning away to make the work go by faster. When noonday came and the sun was high in the sky, Batushka set down her spinning, gave a bit of bread to each goat, and scampered into the woods to collect her berries. Then she ate her lunch, and as she brushed the crumbs away for the birds, she spoke to her goats. "Oh, my little goats, I mustn't dance as usual today." Suddenly Batushka started with a jump, for a voice came through the trees. "Why mustn't you dance today?" It was that same sweet voice she had heard the day before. She closed her eyes tightly, for after what happened yesterday, she was quite scared this time. But the maiden repeated her question, so Batushka gave her a timid answer. "Forgive me, beautiful lady, but I cannot dance with you, for if I dance with you again, then I cannot spin my flax. And if I do not spin my flax, then my mother will be very cross with me. Today, before the sun sets, I must make up for what I failed to spin yesterday." The maiden was not dissuaded. Instead, she said, "Oh, my dear child, don't worry about that. We'll find a way of getting that spinning done. Come, dear one, dance with me." Russian fairy tale illustrated by Frank C. Pape, 1916. Before she knew what was happening, the maiden had tucked up her skirt and taken Batushka by the hands. Again, together they whirled, and again the branches were filled with the feathered musicians making the most enchanting music. Batushka was, for a second time, mesmerized by the beauty of this maiden who radiated as she danced. She forgot all about her spinning and her goats, and all she wanted to do was dance forever. Then, for the second day in a row, the sun began to set, the music stopped, and the maiden stopped her dancing. Batushka snapped to reality. Immediately, she put her hands to her head where all her flax was wound and found it was still there. The poor girl burst into tears at the thought that 2 days' work was not done. The beautiful maiden dried her tears and reached out to take the flax from the girl's head. Then she picked up a thin birch branch, wound the flax round it, took the spindle, and began to spin the flax into yarn. Matushka could not believe her eyes as the lady spun so quickly but gracefully, producing a beautiful yarn. Before the sun disappeared from sight, all the flax was spun, even the portion from the previous day. Then the maiden handed the full spindle to Batushka and said, "Girl, listen carefully and remember these words. Reel and grumble not. Reel and grumble not." After the words were spoken, the lady disappeared from sight. At this time, Batushka was so very happy that she skipped and sang all the way home, saying to herself, "The lady is so good and so kind. I will definitely dance with her again if she asks me to. And oh, how I hope she does." And the girl and her nanny goats made their way cheerfully home. When she arrived at the cottage, Batushka's mother was waiting at the door and appeared very cross. She had finally realized that there was no yarn spun the day before. "What were you so busy doing yesterday that you did not spin the flax?" her mother demanded. Batushka hated to be scolded, so she hung her head, still feeling guilty about not doing her chore properly. But then she remembered the double full spindle in her basket. Her face brightened as she pulled it out and said, "See, mother, today I'm more than made up for yesterday." The girl beamed. Well, that satisfied her mother, who took the spindle and said no more about it. Batushka forgot all about the words from the maiden. She had wanted to tell her mother the whole story, but then she doubted her impulse. No, she told herself, dance with her once more and ask who she is first, or mother may scold me for dancing with a stranger. And so Batushka said nothing about the maiden and did not repeat the words she was told. Art by William Adolphe Bourgereau. On the third morning, she walked her goats along the same route as usual. They reached the birch wood, and the goats went to pasture, and Batushka sat down under a tree where she began to spin and sing. When the sun reached high noon, she set her spindle aside and gave the goats a bit of bread, gathered some berries, and ate her midday meal. She sprinkled her crumbs down for the birds and cheerfully said to her goats, "Today I will dance with you." So she stood up and assumed position. And just as she was preparing to dance as gracefully as the maiden appeared there in front of her. "Let us dance together," the lady shone as brightly as she had before as she smiled down at Batushka. Hand in hand, they began to whirl in the sunlight while the birds made their music in the trees. Again, Batushka was mesmerized, and she could see nothing but the maiden and hear nothing but the bird song. Her feet seemed to move on their own volition, and she felt weightless as the two swished through the air. Again they danced from noon until sundown, and again the music came to a sudden stop, and the maiden paused her dance. Batushka, snapping to attention, looked around her. The sun was already to set below the trees. She felt the flax still spun around her head, and the poor girl began to cry. "Oh, my mother was already so cross with me yesterday. How how she will scold me today." Her tears were flowing. Art by Arthur Hughes, 1865. Quiet yourself, my dear girl. Everything will be fine. Give me your little basket, said the bright lady, and I will put something in it that will more than make up for today's undone spinning. So Batushka handed over her basket, and as soon as it was in the maiden's hand, she vanished from sight. Batushka's heart dropped to her stomach, but within a moment the lady reappeared. She handed her back the basket and said, "Listen carefully to my words. Look not inside until you're home. Look not inside until you're home." Batushka wanted so very much to take a peek inside the basket, but she was afraid to. The basket felt so light, and it seemed to hold nothing at all. All the walk home it nagged her that maybe the maiden had fooled her. Finally, as she was almost home, her curiosity overtook her, and she just had to take a look inside. But she saw nothing but birch tree leaves, and at that poor Batushka burst into tears yet again and scolded herself for being such a fool. So upset was she that she took a handful of leaves out and tossed them on the ground. She was about to turn the whole basket upside down and shake them all out, but something in her mind told her to stop. No, she thought, the leaves can be used for as bedding for the goats, and she finished the way home with a heavy heart. When she finally arrived at the cottage, she was so afraid to face her mother with nothing to show for her day except a basket of old leaves. But her mother opened the door more excited than she had seen her for some time. "For heaven's sake, Batushka, what kind of a spool did you bring me home yesterday?" she cried. Worried now, Batushka stammered as she asked why her mother was asking about the spool. "Because when you left for the woods this morning," explained her mother, "I started to reel that yarn. I reeled and I reeled, and the spool remained full as if it had not been reeled at all. One skein, two skeins, three skeins, and still the spool remained full. Thinking it must be spooked, I cried out, 'What evil spirit has spun this?' As soon as I said it, all the yarn still on the spool vanished, like it was blown away. Batushka, tell me, where did you get that spool?" Now Batushka had no choice but to tell her mother the whole story. And when she had finished, her mother exclaimed, "Oh, my dear girl, that was a wood maiden. At noon and at midnight the wood maidens dance. It is well good that you are not a little boy, or she might have danced you to death. But they are often kind to little girls and sometimes give them generous presents. Why didn't you tell me? If I had not grumbled, I could have had enough yarn to fill up the whole house." Then Batushka remembered her basket and wondered if maybe there was something special under the leaves that she had missed. So she took out the spindle and her unspun flax and looked again. "Oh, mother," she cried, "quickly come and see." Her mother ran over to see, and immediately her jaw dropped as her hands went up to her cheeks in awe. The birch leaves had all turned to solid gold. Again Batushka scolded herself and told her mother how she had disobeyed the wood maiden by looking inside the basket and had thrown some of the leaves away in frustration. "Well," said her mother, "it is lucky that you did not empty the whole basket." Very early the next morning she herself went to look for the handful of leaves that her daughter had dropped. She did find them laying right where Batushka had said, but they were only ordinary birch leaves. It did not even matter. There were enough leaves of gold in that basket for her mother to buy them a farm with fields to grow and cattle to milk. Matushka had the prettiest new clothes, and she no longer had to pasture goats day in and day out. But no matter what she did, and no matter how joyful her new life was, still nothing ever gave her quite as much pleasure as she had dancing with the wood maiden. She often went back to the same birch wood, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, but she never saw the Wood Maiden again. The end. Birchwood Forest, an illustration by Sutton Palmer, 1904. And I plan to do more reading, not today. Um, so those were the two stories. You may have already listened to the Hoppatrot. If you haven't, I appreciate if you, or you might enjoy looking at that one too. But at the beginning of the book, there's commentary that Miss Carolyn Emerick has written, and I'll be reading not only the introduction, but be reading chapter 2. Well, let's see, what's chapter 1? That is the introduction. Okay, chapter 2. Much has been written in recent years about the resurgence of the divine feminine. So I'm going to read to you about our lost goddesses lived on. So stay tuned. That will be kind of that's a full post I can create on that one. So there's several chapters here that have to do with fairy tales, and in particular these fairy tales. Some great commentaries that the grown-ups and older children would really like. All right, thank you for listening. You have a good week now.